For 200 years, one of America's most elegant family portraits hung in museums and private collections, admired by thousands of visitors who gazed upon the refined beauty of three white women in silk gowns and pearl jewelry. Art historians cataloged it, curators displayed it, students studied it in textbooks. But not a single person noticed what was hiding in plain sight, something so obvious that once you see it, you can never unsee it. A black hand deliberately painted into the composition, reaching from the shadows toward the white family at the center of the frame. This is the story of how one portrait concealed the truth about American slavery for 2 centuries, how a modern researcher finally saw what everyone else had missed, and how this single painting exposes the invisible presence of enslaved people in every corner of wealthy American life. Because sometimes the most important truths are the ones staring us in the face that we've been trained not to see. The painting is called Mrs. James Smith and Grandson, but that title is a lie, or at least an incomplete truth, because the portrait actually shows Mrs. Elizabeth Willing Smith seated with her 2 granddaughters, not a grandson at all. Created in 1776 by artist Charles Willson Peale, one of America's most celebrated portrait painters, the work depicts Elizabeth Smith in the center wearing an elegant burgundy dress with white lace trim, her silver hair styled in the fashionable powdered curls of the colonial elite. To her left sits one granddaughter in pale blue silk, and to her right another in cream-colored satin. They're posed in a drawing room with rich wood paneling visible behind them, sunlight streaming through an unseen window illuminating their faces with that soft golden glow that marks wealth and privilege in 18th century portraiture. Everything about the painting screams refinement, status, and the kind of old money that built colonial Philadelphia. The Smith family were among the wealthiest merchants in Pennsylvania, their fortune built on international trade, real estate, and the complex web of commerce that connected colonial America to the broader Atlantic economy. This portrait was commissioned to celebrate family continuity, to preserve the image of 3 generations of Smith women for posterity, to announce to anyone who entered their home that this family mattered, that they had taste, that they had arrived. And for 200 years, that's exactly how people saw it. Art historians described it as a fine example of Peale's domestic portraiture from his Philadelphia period. Museum labels identified the subjects by name and noted the quality of the brushwork, the subtle modeling of the faces, the attention to textile details in the rendering of silk and lace. When the painting was loaned to exhibitions, curators praised Peale's ability to capture the intimacy of family relationships while maintaining the formal dignity expected in portraiture of the era. Students learning about colonial American art studied this painting alongside dozens of others from the same period, all showing wealthy white families posed in their finest clothing, all reinforcing the same narrative about who mattered in early America, whose faces deserved to be preserved for history, whose stories were worth remembering. The painting moved from private collection to private collection, eventually ending up in institutional hands where it could be studied and preserved as part of America's artistic heritage. And through all those decades, through all those viewings, through all that scholarly attention, nobody saw the hand. It's there on the left side of the painting, emerging from the dark background between the grandmother and one of the granddaughters. A brown-skinned hand, unmistakably darker than the pale white hands of the 3 central figures, reaching toward the family group from somewhere outside the frame. The hand is small, delicate probably, belonging to a woman, or perhaps a child. It's positioned carefully, deliberately, placed exactly where it needed to be to remain part of the composition while also remaining invisible to viewers who weren't looking for it. And that's the key to understanding why nobody noticed for 200 years. We weren't looking for it. We'd been trained by centuries of looking at colonial portraits to focus on the white faces at the center, to read these paintings as being about the wealthy families they depicted, to understand them as celebrations of individual achievement and family continuity within the white upper class. The enslaved people who made that wealth possible, who maintained those elegant homes, who raised those children, who cooked the food and cleaned the rooms and performed the 1,000 invisible labors that sustained elite colonial life. They weren't supposed to be part of the story. They were background, context, property, not people whose presence needed to be acknowledged or recorded. But Charles Willson Peale knew they were there. He saw them every day as he moved through the homes of his wealthy patrons. He watched enslaved servants moving through rooms, carrying trays, tending fires, dressing their mistresses, caring for children. He understood that no portrait of colonial wealth was complete without acknowledging, even if only subtly, the human labor that made that wealth possible. So he painted the hand, not prominently, not as the focus of the composition, but present, undeniable to anyone who actually looked at the full painting, rather than just the 3 white faces at its center. The hand is reaching toward something, possibly toward one of the children, possibly adjusting clothing or offering something just outside our view. The gesture suggests care, service, the intimate proximity that defined the relationship between enslaved domestic workers and the white families who owned them. This wasn't some stranger standing at a distance. This was someone who was allowed, required even, to touch these white bodies, to dress them, to care for them, to be physically close to them, in ways that the racial hierarchies of slavery otherwise strictly prohibited. The discovery that finally brought the hand to public attention came in 2023 when Dr. Titus Kaphar, an artist and scholar who focuses on making visible the invisible presences in historical art, was studying Peale's body of work for an exhibition about portraiture and power in early America. Kaphar had developed a methodology for analyzing colonial-era portraits that specifically looked for signs of enslaved presence, the subtle ways that artists acknowledged the people who made wealthy white life possible, even as the conventions of portraiture demanded they remain marginal to the composition. He knew that artists like Peale, who were relatively progressive for their time and who engaged with abolitionist ideas, even if they didn't always act on them, sometimes included small details that complicated the simple narratives of white wealth and respectability that their patrons wanted projected. So Kaphar looked carefully at the edges of paintings, at the backgrounds, at the spaces between central figures where something unexpected might have been tucked away. When he examined high-resolution digital images of the Smith family portrait, the hand jumped out at him immediately. How had nobody seen this before? He checked the scholarly literature, the museum records, the auction catalogs from every time the painting had changed hands. Nothing. Not a single mention of the enslaved person whose hand Peale had painted into the composition. The invisibility was so complete that even when the painting was professionally photographed for publications, even when conservators examined it closely for restoration purposes, even when art historians wrote detailed analyses of Peale's technique and compositional choices, the hand simply didn't register as something worth mentioning. It was there in plain sight, visible in every reproduction, present in every viewing, but 200 years of trained blindness meant that nobody actually saw it. Kaphar's revelations sparked immediate controversy. Some art historians initially pushed back, suggesting he was seeing something that wasn't there or overinterpreting a shadow or fold of fabric. But once he pointed out the exact location, once viewers knew to look for it, the hand became impossible to deny. It's not ambiguous. It's not a trick of light or an artifact of aging paint. It's a carefully rendered brown-skinned human hand, painted with the same attention to anatomical detail that Peale brought to the hands of his white subjects, positioned deliberately within the composition. The question wasn't whether the hand was there. The question was why nobody had noticed it for 2 centuries, and what that said about how we've been trained to look at images of American history. Understanding why the hand remained invisible for so long requires understanding how portraiture functioned in colonial America, and how we've been taught to read these images. In the 18th century, having your portrait painted was an extraordinary expense, affordable only to the wealthiest families. The portrait wasn't just a picture. It was a statement of social position, a claim to permanence and importance, a way of announcing that your family had achieved a level of wealth and status that deserved to be recorded for posterity. Every element of the composition was carefully controlled to project the right message. The clothing had to be expensive enough to demonstrate wealth, but tasteful enough to suggest refinement. The setting had to imply comfort and culture without appearing ostentatious. The poses had to convey appropriate gender roles, family relationships, and moral character. These weren't candid snapshots. They were carefully constructed narratives about who these people claimed to be. In that context, the presence of enslaved servants presented a complicated problem. On one hand, owning enslaved people was a marker of wealth and status that many elite families wanted to advertise. In some Southern portraits, enslaved attendants appear more prominently, often standing in the background or positioned at the edges of compositions in ways that clearly mark them as servants, while also demonstrating the family's wealth. But in northern cities like Philadelphia, where the Smith family lived, the politics of slavery were more complicated. By 1776, when Peale painted this portrait, Pennsylvania had a significant Quaker population that opposed slavery on religious grounds, and abolitionist sentiment was growing among educated urban elites, even as they continued to own enslaved people and profit from slavery's economic structures. Many wealthy northern families wanted to enjoy the benefits of enslaved labor while also maintaining a public image of enlightenment and moral respectability. They wanted the servants, but didn't want to be too obvious about it. So artists like Peale developed visual strategies for acknowledging enslaved presence without making it the focus of the painting. The hand in the Smith portrait is a perfect example of this compromise. It's there, undeniable if you look for it, but positioned and rendered in ways that allow it to fade into the background if you're not paying attention. The hand emerges from shadows, making it easy for the eye to skip over it as part of the dark background. It's placed between two of the central figures, in a space where the composition naturally guides the viewer's eye toward the white faces rather than toward what's happening at the margins. It's painted with relatively less detail and contrast than the hands of the three white women, which are rendered in bright light with careful attention to the play of light on skin, the delicate veining, the indication of rings and lace cuffs. The enslaved hand is present, but muted, visible but easy to ignore, there but not demanding attention. This visual strategy reflects the broader social reality of enslaved domestic workers in wealthy colonial homes. They were everywhere and nowhere, intimately involved in every aspect of daily life but socially invisible, required to be constantly present and attentive, but trained to seem as though they weren't really there at all. They dressed their mistresses but weren't supposed to be seen as having their own thoughts or feelings about the intimate access this required. They raised children but weren't supposed to form bonds that might complicate the master's absolute ownership. They prepared food and set tables but weren't supposed to be present as people when the family sat down to eat. They moved through rooms, cleaning, maintaining, serving, but were expected to be as invisible as furniture, noticed only when something went wrong or when their service was needed. The enslaved hand in the portrait captures this impossible contradiction perfectly. Absolutely essential to the scene, required for the whole image to make sense as a depiction of actual life in a wealthy household, but positioned and rendered in ways that 2 centuries of viewers could look right past without registering its presence. Once you see the hand, once you understand what you're looking at, the entire painting changes. Suddenly, this isn't just a portrait of 3 generations of white women celebrating family continuity and inherited wealth. It's a document of the enslaved labor that made that wealth possible, a record of the intimate violence of a system where human beings could be owned and their service taken for granted to such an extent that their presence literally became invisible. The painting becomes a kind of archaeological evidence, preserving something that the Smith family and their descendants probably never intended to preserve. Because here's what makes this discovery so powerful. If we don't have the names of most enslaved people who worked in northern households like the Smiths, if we don't have records of their lives or their experiences or their stories, if the archive of slavery has rendered them largely invisible to history, this painting preserves at minimum the fact of their presence. Someone was there. Someone's hand reached toward this family. Someone dressed these children, maintained this household, made this scene of domestic tranquility possible. Someone existed, even if we don't know their name. Researchers have attempted to identify whose hand appears in the painting by examining Smith family records from the period. We know the family owned several enslaved people in 1776. Property inventories from estates list them by first name only, the usual practice for recording human property, making it nearly impossible to trace individual stories. We know there was an enslaved woman named Bet who worked in the household in the 1770s. But we don't know if she's the person whose hand Peale painted. We know there were enslaved children in the household as well, and the small size of the hand suggests it could belong to a child or young teenager. But the archival silence around enslaved people in northern households means we probably will never know for certain whose hand this was. What we do know is that this person was close enough to the family to appear in their portrait, trusted or required to be in intimate physical contact with the children, and present in the room when Peale was composing and sketching the painting. That last detail is worth dwelling on. For Peale to have painted the hand with this level of accuracy, the enslaved person had to have been there during the sitting sessions. Portrait painting in the 18th century required multiple sessions over days or weeks, with subjects posing while the artist worked. This wasn't a quick photograph. It was an extended process during which the artist studied his subjects carefully, observing how light fell on fabric and skin, how bodies related to each other in space, how to capture not just likeness but character and relationship. The enslaved servant would have been in the room during these sessions, probably performing their usual duties, possibly literally holding or positioning the children as Peale worked. The artist would have observed them closely enough to paint their hand with anatomical accuracy, to capture the gesture of reaching or adjusting or offering whatever service was being performed. The enslaved person was there, seen by Peale, included in his composition, but rendered in ways that made them invisible to generations of later viewers. This pattern of invisible enslaved presence in colonial portraiture turns out to be more common than art historians previously recognized. Since Caffar's discovery of the hand in the Smith portrait, researchers have begun examining other paintings from the same period with new attention to margins, shadows, and background details. They've found similar examples in dozens of other works. A portrait of a Maryland family includes a partial figure in a doorway, dark-skinned and dressed in servant's clothing, carrying a tea service. A painting of a Virginia wedding shows what appears to be an enslaved child in the far background, barely visible but undeniably present. A portrait of a South Carolina rice planter includes what might be the edge of a dark-skinned figure standing just outside the frame, suggested by a hand and part of an arm visible at the painting's border. Each of these examples follow the same pattern: enslaved people painted into compositions in ways that acknowledged their presence, while keeping them marginal enough to be easily overlooked, easily forgotten, easily erased from our understanding of what these paintings depicted. The invisibility of enslaved people in colonial portraits mirrors their invisibility in the historical record more broadly. When we learn about the founding era in schools, we learn about Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and Hamilton, about constitutional debates and revolutionary ideals and the birth of democracy. We learn much less about the enslaved people who built the houses these men lived in, who cooked their food and cleaned their clothes and raised their children. who created the material conditions that gave these famous men the leisure and education to develop their political philosophies. We learn about elegant colonial homes and sophisticated cultural life in cities like Philadelphia and Charleston, but not about the enslaved domestic workers who maintained those homes and made that cultural life possible. We learn about economic development and growing prosperity in the colonies, but not about how much of that prosperity was built directly on enslaved labor, not just in southern plantation agriculture, but in northern shipping, manufacturing, and commerce that depended on the slave trade and slavery's products. The hand in the portrait is a challenge to this selective memory. It insists that we acknowledge the presence of enslaved people in every aspect of colonial life, including and especially in those spaces we tend to imagine as most refined, most civilized, most removed from slavery's brutality. The Smith family drawing room, site of this elegant portrait, was also a space where enslaved people labored. The domestic tranquility and family intimacy the painting celebrates was made possible by the unpaid labor of people who had no families of their own recognized by law, no intimate spaces of their own, no control over their own bodies or time or futures. Every meal served, every fire tended, every child watched, every floor cleaned, every garment pressed was the work of enslaved hands that elite families took so much for granted that they could literally become invisible even when painted directly into family portraits. What makes the Smith portrait particularly fascinating is its timing. Painted in 1776, the same year the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, the painting captures the extraordinary contradiction at the heart of revolutionary America. The Smith family, like many elite colonials, embraced revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and natural rights, while simultaneously denying those rights to the people they enslaved. Philadelphia, where the Smiths lived and where Peale painted, was the birthplace of American democracy, the city where the Continental Congress met, where the Declaration was signed, where the Constitution would later be debated. It was also a city where slavery remained legal until 1780, where wealthy families like the Smiths continued to own human beings even as they celebrated political freedom, where the same men who wrote eloquent philosophical treatises about the rights of man went home to houses maintained by enslaved servants. Charles Willson Peale himself embodied these contradictions. He was sympathetic to abolitionist arguments and would eventually free the enslaved people he owned. He was friends with Benjamin Franklin and other Pennsylvania abolitionists. He participated in the founding of organizations dedicated to gradual emancipation. But throughout his career, he continued to paint portraits for slave-owning families, to accept their commissions, to create images that celebrated their wealth and status without directly challenging the source of that wealth. The hand in the Smith portrait might be read as a subtle form of commentary, Peale's way of insisting on the presence of enslaved people, even in a genre that typically rendered them invisible. But it's a very subtle gesture, easily missed, easily ignored, not a bold political statement but a quiet acknowledgement that barely disrupts the painting's primary function as a celebration of white family continuity and inherited status. The question of artistic intention is difficult to resolve. Did Peale deliberately paint the hand as a form of subtle political commentary, a way of making visible the enslaved presence that his patrons wanted to ignore, or was he simply painting what he saw, including the enslaved servant who was actually present in the room during the sitting sessions, without thinking deeply about the political implications? We don't have Peale's own commentary on this specific painting, no letters or diary entries explaining his choices. What we have is the painting itself, and the fact that it preserves something that 200 years of viewers managed not to see. Whatever Peale's conscious intention, the result is a historical document that forces us to confront how we've been trained to look at images of American history, what we've been taught to focus on, and what we've learned to overlook. The rediscovery of the hand in 2023 coincided with broader national conversations about how we remember and represent American history, particularly the history of slavery. Museums across the country have begun reinterpreting their collections with explicit attention to enslaved presence and enslaved labor. Historic houses that once gave tours focused exclusively on famous white residents now include substantial discussion of enslaved people who lived and worked in those spaces. Textbooks are being rewritten to give more attention to slavery's central role in American economic development. The 1619 Project and similar initiatives have sparked intense debates about how to teach the history of slavery and its ongoing legacy. In this context, the discovery of the hand feels particularly resonant. Here's physical evidence that enslaved people were always there, always central to the scenes we've been taught to read as being exclusively about white achievement and white family life, but that we've systematically trained ourselves not to see. Since the hand became widely known, the Smith family portrait has been used extensively in educational settings as a teaching tool about historical visibility and visibility, about how archives are constructed and what gets preserved or erased, about the politics of looking and what we're trained to notice or ignore. Students are shown the painting and asked to describe what they see. Almost everyone focuses immediately on the three white women at the center. Then they're told there's something else in the painting, something that thousands of previous viewers missed, and challenged to find it. When they finally spot the hand, the moment of recognition is often visceral, accompanied by gasps or exclamations. Once you see it, they report, you can't understand how you didn't see it immediately, how you looked right past something so obvious. That moment of recognition becomes a powerful metaphor for how historical blindness works, how we can look directly at evidence of slavery's presence in every corner of American life and somehow not see it, how the archive can preserve information that remains effectively invisible until someone points it out. The painting now hangs in a different context than it did for most of its history. Modern museum labels explicitly discuss the enslaved presence, describing the hand in detail and using it as an entry point for conversations about domestic slavery in northern colonies. Educational materials developed around the painting emphasize that every elegant colonial portrait, every beautiful historic house, every celebration of Revolutionary-era achievement needs to be understood as also a document of enslaved labor. The painting has become a powerful tool for teaching about the absolute centrality of slavery to colonial American life, even and especially in northern cities, and among families who didn't think of themselves primarily as slaveholders. But the discovery of the hand also raises uncomfortable questions about art historical practice and museum curation. How did generations of trained experts manage to miss something so obvious once you know to look for it? Part of the answer is technical. Many art historians studied the painting through black and white reproductions in books where the tonal differences that make the hand visible in color images were less apparent. Part of the answer is about conservation. The painting underwent several restorations over the centuries, and it's possible that varnish and aging obscured some details. But the larger answer is about trained blindness, about what disciplines teach people to notice and what they teach people to ignore. Art historical training emphasized careful analysis of central compositional elements, the faces and poses and clothing of primary subjects. It taught students to read these paintings as being fundamentally about the white families they depicted. It didn't encourage looking at margins and shadows for evidence of enslaved presence, because the field as a whole didn't consider enslaved people's presence to be part of what was historically significant about these works. This disciplinary blindness wasn't accidental or innocent. It reflected and reinforced broader patterns of how American history has been written and taught. Patterns that centered white achievement while marginalizing or erasing the experiences and contributions of black people, enslaved and free. If the goal of art history was to celebrate American artistic achievement, to trace the development of American culture, to identify the great American artists and their masterworks, then paying attention to enslaved people in portraits seemed tangential to the discipline's core concerns. The painting was valuable as an example of Peale's skill, as a document of colonial fashion and domestic architecture, as evidence of Philadelphia's cultural sophistication. The enslaved hand was just background, not worth mentioning, not part of the story art historians were trained to tell. Changing how we see this painting requires changing what we think paintings are for, what they can teach us, whose stories matter. Instead of reading the Smith portrait primarily as a celebration of elite white family continuity, we can read it as evidence of enslaved domestic labor in northern households. Instead of focusing exclusively on what the painting tells us about Charles Willson Peale's artistic technique, we can ask what it tells us about the daily lives of enslaved people in Revolutionary-era Philadelphia. Instead of treating the three white women as the only subjects who matter, we can try to understand the painting as also being about the unseen and largely unnamed enslaved person whose hand Peale painted, whose labor made the scene possible, whose story the archive has largely erased, but whose presence the painting undeniably records. That shift in perspective doesn't mean ignoring the painting's artistic qualities or the lives of the Smith family. It means reading more completely, seeing more fully, acknowledging all of what the painting shows us rather than just the parts that fit comfortable narratives about colonial refinement and revolutionary ideals. It means recognizing that every image of wealth from the slaveholding era is also an image of slavery, that every celebration of white achievement requires acknowledging the black labor that made that achievement possible, that every family portrait from this period is also a document of the enslaved people who maintained those families' homes and raised their children and created the material conditions for their comfort. The hand in the portrait has become a symbol, a powerful visual metaphor for all the ways enslaved people's presence was simultaneously essential and invisible in colonial American life. But it's important to remember that the hand in this painting belonged to a real person, someone with thoughts and feelings and experiences that will almost certainly never recover. Someone who got up in the morning and performed the labor of maintaining the Smith household. Someone who may have felt affection for the children they cared for, or may have resented every moment spent serving the people who owned them. Someone who had dreams of freedom that were probably never realized. Someone whose name we likely don't know, but whose hand Charles Willson Peale painted, preserving for history at least the fact of their presence, even if the full story of their life remains lost. 200 years of blindness followed by sudden recognition. A hand hiding in plain sight, visible to anyone who knew to look but invisible to thousands of trained viewers. A painting that seemed to be about white family intimacy, but that actually documents the intimate violence of slavery. This is the power of the Smith family portrait and the enslaved hand it conceals and reveals. It teaches us that historical truth can be staring us in the face and we still might not see it, that what we're trained to notice and what we're trained to overlook shapes our understanding of history as much as what actually happened. That sometimes the most important stories are the ones that have been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see what's actually there. The hand reaches toward us across 2.5 centuries, insisting that we acknowledge its presence, that we recognize the person it belonged to, that we understand American history as also and always the story of enslaved people whose labor built this country, and whose presence shaped every aspect of colonial life, including and especially those elegant portraits that were supposed to celebrate only white achievement and white family continuity. Once you see the hand, you can never unsee it, and once you understand what it represents, you can never look at American history the same way again.